Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the weekly Facebook Live Bible Study, Week 22. Last week, we discussed 1 Chronicles. We talked about the layout of the book, how the author portrays David as a good character, essentially hiding his flaws. We also discussed the final part of Ephesians and Paul's final words to the people of Ephesus. This week, we're going to talk about 2 Chronicles. We're going to talk about what the book and what the author primarily calls the reader to do. We're also going to discuss Philippians, and we're going to talk about what Paul tells the people in Philippi and what he essentially talks to them about and how he essentially thanks them for all that they're doing. Now, let's go on to the book of 2 Chronicles. The book of 2 Chronicles is the final book in the Jewish scriptures, and it ends by pointing forward to the future. It calls upon God's people to look back in order to look ahead, because the past is a source of hope for the future. As we continue into 2 Chronicles, we find a lot of overlap with 1st and 2nd Kings. However, there are a couple of important differences, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. One of the biggest differences is the fact that the author leaves out a lot of the stories of the kings and the northern kingdom of Israel and places special focus on David and his line. Now, there's a lot of new materials and stories about the line of David and the kings that come from that line. The author highlights those who were obedient to God and how they gained success and blessing. The author supplies new stories about kings who were unfaithful to God as well. The author discusses how those kings who failed to follow the Torah and eventually led Israel into idol worship and faced horrible consequences and ultimately brought about the Babylonian exile. The author clearly establishes how Israel's fall is their own fault. As the book continues, we find a series of character studies, which was specifically made for the later generations of Israel. The author wants all of God's people to learn from their family history and to become faithful to their God and to the Torah. At the very end of this book, the king of Persia, Cyrus, tells the Israelites that they can return from exile and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He tells them that if they want, they can go. The book ends with an incomplete sentence. The author does not show the prophetic hope of Israel as fulfilled in the line of David, yet. This incomplete ending shows that the author's hope is set on return from exile when Jesus will come to rebuild the temple and restore God's people. That concludes the book of 2 Chronicles. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, we ask that you post them, and together we can grow in Christ by addressing them. Now let's move on to Philippians. The church in Philippi was the first Jesus community that Paul started in Eastern Europe. Philippi was a Roman colony in ancient Macedonia, which was full of retired soldiers and was well known for its patriotic nationalism. Paul faced resistance there for announcing Jesus as the true king of the world. After Paul had moved on, those who did become followers of Jesus continued to suffer persecution, but they remained a vibrant community, faithful to the teachings of Jesus. Paul sent them this letter during his imprisonment. The Philippians had sent one of their members, Epaphroditus, to take a financial gift to Paul and to support him in prison. Paul sends this letter back with Epaphroditus to say thanks for the generous gift as well as a whole lot more. The design of this letter does not develop one singular idea from beginning to end like many of his other letters do. Instead, Paul has arranged a series of short reflective vignettes revolving around the poem in chapter 2, which talks about the Messiah's incarnation, life, death, resurrection, and exaltation. Paul takes up keywords and ideas from the poem to show how living as a Christian means seeing your own story as a lived expression of Jesus' story. Chapter 1 opens with a prayer of gratitude as Paul thanks God for the Philippians' generosity and faithfulness. He expresses his confidence that the life transformation work that God has begun in them will continue to grow into greater, more beautiful expressions of faithfulness and love. Paul then focuses on the obvious concern at the moment, his status in prison. While being in a Roman prison is quite harsh, Paul tells the Philippians that being imprisoned has turned out for good because it has helped advance the good news about Jesus. His imprisonment has inspired confidence in other Christians to talk about Jesus more openly And while Paul is optimistic that he'll be released, he still addresses the possibility that he will be executed, and he decides that dying would be much better. For Paul, his life in the present and future is defined by the life of and love of Jesus. If he is executed, he would be for Jesus. If he is released, he could keep working to start more Jesus communities. Paul makes it clear that dying for Jesus is not the real sacrifice. It's staying alive to serve others. It's Paul's way of participating in the story of Jesus, who suffered in order to love others more than himself. In chapter 1, verse 27 through chapter 2, verse 18, Paul turns his attentions to the Philippians. And he urges them to participate in Jesus' example by taking up the same mindset. He tells them that their life as citizens should be consistent with the good news about the Messiah. These Christians lived in a hotbed of Roman patriotism, but their way of life is shaped by King Jesus, which could easily bring persecution. They are not to be afraid because suffering for association with Jesus is a way of living out the story of self-giving love for others. This leads Paul into the great poem of chapter 2. It's rich and echoes key Old Testament texts, specifically the story of Adam and his rebellion, as well as poems about the suffering servant from chapters 45, 52, and 53 of Isaiah. Now, before Jesus became human, he pre-existed in a state of glory unequal to God. Unlike Adam, who tried to have equality with God, Jesus did not exploit his equal status for self-advantage. Instead, Jesus emptied himself to become human, a servant to all. Jesus allowed himself to be humiliated, but he was obedient to the Father by going to his death on a Roman execution cross. Through God's power and grace, the Messiah's shameful death was reversed through the resurrection, highly exalting Jesus as King of all. He was bestowed the name above all names so that all creation should now recognize that Jesus is Lord, the Spirit, and the Son. Paul quotes Isaiah 45, verse 23 to make the point that we will discover the one true God as Jesus. This poem expresses Paul's own convictions about who Jesus is and offers the examples of Jesus as a way of life that his followers are to imitate. In chapter 2, verse 19 through 30, Paul immediately follows up with two stories. One is about Timothy and one is about Epaphroditus, because they are both examples of people living out Jesus' story. Timothy is like Jesus in that he's constantly concerned for the well-being of others more than himself, making sacrifices to serve them. Epaphroditus, who the Philippians sent with their gift, risked his life to serve Paul in prison. He got very sick and almost died, and God had mercy on him and spared Paul the loss of a friend. Paul's point in that is that these kinds of people are living, breathing examples of the life and story of Jesus and are worthy of imitation. This concludes the first half of the book of Philippians. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, we ask that you post them, and together we can grow in Christ by addressing them. Thank you.